Anyways, I'm here with my guest here. If you want to introduce yourself.
Michael Lowande, that's my given name, and it's a pleasure to be your guest.
Well, thank you.
Sincere pleasure.
I really hope we ingratiate some fruitful conversation and thought-provoking, and
I don't think we can help it.
it comes naturally, and we can show people how it can come naturally for them too.
It's primarily what they've done to us again, and it's happened several times in our country's history. We've only had two middle classes in this whole 200 years we've been around.
But I mean, you could say that the rich also would do the same thing for the power and the everything else.
But since they have the advantage of having wealth, really what they've been obsessed with all this time is trying to find a moral reason for their greed.
Well, obviously, yeah, and that's backwards think, because yeah.
But that's a lot of the propaganda we've been subjected to.
Well, sure.
And a lot of us folks are eating it up right now because it's on TV, and well, Fox News is right, and short hair and dressed neat, and they're all about might is right.
Well, yeah, and that's always been the funny thing, right? It's like, so if you don't pay attention and you don't look deeply into anything, or you're not used to looking deeply into anything, should I say?
No critical thinking.
Right, none at all. Then people, those types of people will sound like they know what they're talking about.
They sure do. I mean, it's all a script.
And that's and that's part of it. And that's been the almost inside joke to me too. I mean, granted, they may really think these things in real life, but what if they're basically at this point actors, right? What if they don't believe any of that shit in real life, and they're just because it's a character they're selling?
A lot of those in positions in the media are like that because, like Michael Savage used to be a left-wing radio announcer.
That's what I thought, but what made him switch? Like,
that's not where the money was.
Okay.
Or the side that's winning.
Right.
And another example is Mussolini. Was a total socialist before he went completely fascist. And again, it's where the bread's buttered.
Yeah. It's interesting.
And a lot of folks have switched, and it could be one or the other, or both, the money, or it's just they want to feel protected, feel safe, and not, on the outside.
Sure.
Going to be put into a concentration camp ultimately, or arrested for their beliefs.
Yeah. Well, obviously nobody wants that.
I've had friends I grew up with that were musicians, artists, and then they became cops because they just got tired of it.
Yeah, sure.
They wanted a safe, secure living, and to hell with it. I'll go harass the poor. So.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, and I'm sure you've known people, you've been around a bit. I'm sure you've known people that are basically, for lack of a better description, Democrats when they don't have money, or like kind of liberally minded when they don't have money, but then when they get money, or they come into some money,
they want to protect it.
They want to protect it, and they become these like kind of conservative Republican types. Like the money itself changes wherever their attitude lies, I guess.
It does, sadly.
Yeah.
Being a capitalist model structure, wealth really is the name of the game. Mm-hmm. It's just nice to have it evenly distributed.
Yeah. Well, sure.
It's like someone in the Scandinavian countries said, how come you don't mind having half of your money taxed and put back into the country? And he said that I would rather be a mediocre, a medium wealthy person in a wealthy country rather than being a wealthy person in a poor country.
Yeah.
They can still see that there. We've lost sight of it here.
Well, sure, and I think, and
I watched it go in the 80s, man.
Sure. Reagan tearing apart the unions and the people being all the mental hospitals that were closed, and
you got to see my film collection sometime, with it, because there's a little propaganda section that specifically does teach people to think a certain way. And quite a few of those films were very popular, but then they were promoted to be popular. They were pushed to be popular. Money was put behind them. They were put in front of us.
Okay, yeah. And I'm sure there's a lot of that. I mean, especially with, and they've they played clips of it on the radio. It just made me think of it because you brought up the '80s or whatever, and that made me think of Reagan, of course.
Sure. He's just an actor, just like Hitler, basically.
The recordings. It came out in the '60s when he was still governor of California about the healthcare thing,
or
about how
colleges were free here until '66 when he was governor.
Well, it was even after that, or in the '70s sometime. It was a proposition just because my dad free junior college, state colleges charged some, but it was a very nominal
livable
fee. Yeah,
they were actually free before 1966. USC was free to go to,
and it was something with property taxes. Is the clearest or most logical, I don't know, however answer you want to explain, describe that, but. That switched, what caused that? The taxes always just seem the clearest answer, at least to me. But
depends on where they go.
Yeah.
If it's justified.
Yeah, and then it makes you, I guess it depends how cynical your mind goes, right? Because then you're like, well, you'd think a government or whoever would want an educated population. And then if they don't want that, or they're making it increasingly more difficult, why?
Well, they don't even teach civics anymore.
No.
They don't want you to know how the government operates, let alone anything.
I mean, yeah, I learned some basic stuff, and that was still in the 90s, and I know it wasn't as strong as, it used to be before that. I'm sure it was still on its way out, but...
in the late 70s, there was a window in time where a lot of books were published and a lot of really great movies came out during the Carter era.
The Network, still one of my favorites.
There you go. That was one of them.
Yeah.
It's how do you explain that? You don't see things like that anymore. But again, my movie collection has a whole bunch of these. I mean, there's almost 100 political films that all teach, but a significant amount of those were from that window in time. But books as well.
Yeah.
And not just political books, spiritual books.
Sure.
There was a lot of Western esotericism being published then that
Sure.
I don't find now. I've gone online and looked. It's really interesting to think that.
Yeah.
And a few of them knew that this was an opportunity in time, that things were about to change. Let's get it out there. Even though for hundreds of years it was always kept under wraps just because of the institutions.
Sure.
The church.
Well, sure. That also, makes me think at least that, we're kind of entering that age of change again, right? Like, just with everything that's been.
So, however.
Well, if we aren't, it's gonna get obviously worse, and maybe it will get worse before it gets better. One of those, almost kind of elementary kind of ideas, but
the ruling class never suffer recessions or depressions. They just move the chess pieces around them to another part of the globe.
Yeah.
And it's been going on that way for about 500 years.
Sure.
Well, actually, you could go back to ancient Rome for that. Charlemagne.
Well, yeah, I mean, as early as there was people who had more, whatever thing was seen of as value.
I could just say, since there were paternalistic cultures.
Yeah, I mean, heck, yeah, that could, yeah. Could be hundreds of thousands of years at that point, yeah, for sure.
Oh gosh, it's about 2,500 years. There were maternalistic cultures before that.
Oh sure, well, all the goddess cultures, and
they're just rediscovering that.
And that kind of led my own thought process, or the idea that right around the time when all those went out was also happened to be the time when all organized religion started being a thing.
Concept.
Right. And so
it's about the time that agriculture got strong, that somebody could store the food.
Yeah.
Control the food, you control the culture.
Right.
For that brutal winter that came around.
Sure. But it's just interesting. I mean, it's important to know why things happen, or just the history of certain
events. It's been my passion
my
whole life.
Yeah, but it's always interesting to me too. Say there's like a period of history or something that you feel like, oh well, you've read or heard a bit about. Not that you're not that you consider yourself an expert, but something that you feel comfortable with, and then you hear just a story kind of within it. It makes you go, huh? Or just some other kind of angle that happened.
Absolutely.
There's
always new stones unturned.
Yeah.
It just seems endless in that sense.
Oh, definitely.
And it all fits together like a puzzle.
Oh, for sure.
But it's true.
Most definitely. I guess that's why I love historical accounts of history. I found this. I've always been a sucker for like used book sales, and sometimes you can find some really good things.
Me too.
And I think it's actually sitting on my shelf over there. It was a book, and it was funny. I found it. It's basically about what happened after Lincoln got shot and all the stuff with.
I was just watching a documentary about Lincoln. It was the untold things. Harmon was one of the authors, I believe.
Okay.
He knew Lincoln and wrote down all kinds of stuff. Harmon was one of the publishers, perhaps. But still, that's one of the names.
Yeah.
Just watched this a week ago, but I didn't retain most of it. I just found it fascinating that there's all these obscure facts about him that history ignored because it didn't fit the myth.
Yeah.
It didn't fit the strong model that they wanted to project.
Sure.
He was quite a fallible man that had quite a few things that he cared about.
Well, sure.
But anyway, that opens another can of worms for me because he was like the perfect person to put out there for the North to fight for the Northern interests, but it really wasn't about slavery ultimately. They would never put their money behind that. The North didn't put their money behind the Civil War to free the slaves. They could have cared less.
It was because
they had a different economic model. It was a competing economic model with the South.
It just happened to be that the South's economic model was based on slaves, which after the war ended and the slaves got freed.
Slaves.
Well, basically, under a different name, yes, but that's when a lot of the poverty started amongst the Dust Bowl kind of
permanent
area.
Underclass,
right? And that's kind of which in some areas there exists to this day.
Yep.
And it's just
sharecroppers. That's what they call
them. Yeah.
Movement?
No, why did Reconstruction fail?
It was never meant to succeed.
I mean,
that's the question I always ask.
Well, sure.
You don't look at the talk about it, but the effect that it had.
Well, of course, and you could always make the emotional argument that obviously it was too much for a certain culture to just automatically go from.
That's a psychological analysis,
right?
Not an economic one, which is always ignored.
So that's what brought me to that book was what exactly, or at least what. Was there something that did it? Was there like a thing that really turned the tide, like an exact thing? And I've always... So at least in that book, Its Opinion, which it was written in 1920, which is cool because,
I still trust books from before World War II much more than after.
And so very kind of politically incorrect by today's terms, it definitely takes a very white perspective. However... The answer at the end of that book, trying to look at it from a pure historical perspective. Mm-hmm. By the end of the book, what that book had to say is that the Whig Party was one of the
Lincoln's original party
was one of the majority slave-owning parties,
mm-hmm.
and so it was like 1787 or 10 years after the war or whatever. Basically the North had made a deal with the South to stop supporting the Whig Party. And so the South said, and then the North would pull its troops from the South. Once that happened, the support got pulled, and then Jim Crow practically started immediately, and lynchings and everything else.
Makes
and
sense.
not that wasn't going on during Reconstruction, but
again, it's
that's
what
the
money.
Yeah,
it's the money
exactly.
behind it. Most wars, revolutions, even
are
supplied by wealth, which really never gets seen or talked about.
Yeah,
but it doesn't just come out of nowhere.
Oh no.
Nothing does.
And it's funny, and maybe I just love using just old examples to show how these concepts are still happening, and it kind of gives us ideas on how to fix them. I mean, one of my favorite characters, and I talk about him all the time, and I put him in my writing, is John Brown.
Yeah. Oh, from Kansas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And just I mean, here's like a guy who was whiter than white. And what was,
he had complete empathy for the slave class.
Well, he basically took it upon him, Potawatomi John, before all the Harper's Ferry stuff, where he basically took escaped slaves, took it upon themselves, went over to slave owners' houses and people, brutally murdered them in front of their families, like, even down to the point where the weapons that they used would have been, native weapons from the African jungles that they were stolen from, and it was just interesting.
Sense of empowerment.
Yeah. And so just the people that were in his group too. So it was that, ran a station along the Underground Railroad, there was that, the people in his group, he had Jews, he had atheists, he had agnostics, he had women.
That's relative again. Human beings was the bottom line.
Well, sure. But to have that kind of faith in differences, because all he cared about was that people had faith in something. Because he was super Calvinist. He was super religious, and here's,
That's interesting, because Calvinists believe that people are wealthy because God bestowed that upon them, because they are the worthy among us.
Which maybe that's what, turned him.
Yeah.
Basically was like, if I have that, then I have to say, I have to help people that aren't. I mean, that was the whole reason.
Makes sense.
It's the whole reason he tried to rob Harper's Ferry, and obviously it never turned out. Like he was supposed to free a few plantations along the way, go to Harper's Ferry with like 4,000 or 5,000 people, steal all the weapons, and then start the big slave revolt. Was the ultimate idea.
Sure.
And his I don't know if it was his talent or his whatever didn't come through, but it's just always and it was interesting because by the end, especially, Frederick Douglass didn't even want anything to do with him. He saw him as too militant.
Yeah, makes sense.
The only one that would really back him from the, if you know the Transcendentalists, what they called them, like Emerson and Thoreau and all the kind of like New England intellectuals in the 1850s or whatever, Thoreau kind of did.
Our first middle class period.
Yeah, Thoreau did, because and when John Brown was trying to get funding for these things for his operations and stuff, he'd go around to all these people that would talk about peace and wanting to, free, people deserve to be free and all this stuff, and he was like, okay, let's go get some guns and let's go do it. People were like, and that kind of idea almost sticks around today too, because you hear a lot of people who love to talk, but when it comes down to actually just maybe being a human being to someone in your life, or the kind of thing, kind of instilling that the ideas that really bring us together in your normal human experiences, when it comes down to that walking the walk, if you will.
There you go. But the more successful you are at that, the more of a threat you become to the owning class.
Sure.
And eventually, if you are successful, they'll find a way, by any means, to
shut you
down.
Well, sure.
Like Judy Berry, the most recent example.
Yeah.
She brought the loggers and the tree huggers together. Mm-hmm. She found their commonalities and ignored the differences. Emphasized the commonalities, and through music, brought them together. That was just too much for the owning class. So they had to set her up. And this happens time and time again. They have the wealth, they have the manpower, endless time to do so.
Well, sure. This is true, and it's funny. A lot of the stuff that we know and truths that we know and stories that have come out and all this stuff has been by people who basically were involved, who've basically seen the light at, for lack of a better phrase, at some point. We're like, this is kind of fucked up. We probably shouldn't be doing this. And
had the language to articulate it.
Exactly. One of my favorites, the other book, John Perkins. Who knows if that was his real name? Anyways, probably wasn't. There was a couple books he wrote, but the one was Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah. I don't know if you ever saw that or So it was just that whole idea where basically anybody who paid attention to stuff knew that kind of thing was going on. Like,
absolutely.
You kind of knew it. But here's a guy who was spelling it out. He's like, yes, this is what we did. this is how we did it.
You nailed it. You got to be paying attention.
We went and had these meetings, and then afterwards,
of course,
when they didn't go for it, they assassinated. You know, the
conspiracies.
Yeah, it was the
group
whole
of people getting together and discussing their commonalities.
Well, sure, but
conspiracy means to breathe the same air.
Yeah. Well, who was the other guy that had a good definition for that? I think it was Richard Clarke. He was like, I think he was Bush's like original counterterrorism guy that quit after, you know, once we went into Iraq, and then had some good things to say.
Anyone in intelligence knows these things.
Yeah.
They've read Sun Tzu.
But that was one of, I thought he gave a somewhat accurate, explanation. Was basically that if life is basically chaos, us trying to make sense out of the chaos is a lot of times where conspiracies come from.
Yeah, it's filling a vacuum.
Right. Where we do our best to describe some of these, and not
that
always.
That presumes that it's talk and not an observation.
Well, sure. But until it's proven, at least to ourselves or in our own minds.
And that's what they control, is the information. How are you going to prove it unless you're one of them, like the economic hitman that went public?
Sure.
But again, I often wonder how they're allowed to publish that and go public. It might be serving a different ends to a means.
Well, it could be, or it
often does.
I mean, everything's serving some sort of end.
Absolutely, but it's what's allowed and what isn't allowed.
Well,
I always have to look at that.
But also there's going to be slivers of light and slivers of truth by stuff.
And they are just slivers usually.
Well, and whether that's feeling good in, mediocrity, I still get excited when I see a little sliver here and there. Because why the hell not? We should. I mean,
we know the truth exists with a capital T.
Yeah.
It's there.
One of my favorite movies, I really liked it, was I think it came out in the late 90s, Bulworth.
Yeah, it's in my collection.
Yeah. Where, the senator who just gets sick of stuff and just goes around telling the truth to everybody.
It's Warren Beatty's fault.
Yeah.
And he's paid a high price in Hollywood for putting out movies like that, like Tim Robbins.
Oh, yeah. Well, we were talking before about Bob Roberts.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so perfectly described that idea.
It does.
You talked about turning the idea of flipping the rebel on its head.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas basically the rebel was basically the guy trying to keep things the way they are.
Absolutely.
And that was seen as the rebel, and then that's going to pull all these people. It's all basically brainwashing people that don't know any better anyways.
You still got to see The Credible Rock. You still have to see that. But again, he's back to theater now, stage, because his movie days are over basically because of this.
Boy, I mean, he did. What was another good one? He was in Arlington Road. Did you ever see that? Where he basically was planting this bomb and pegged this other guy, and
I've never heard
this whole
of
conspiracy.
I'll be damned.
A good one. It was on the $5 movie rack, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but it was really good.
Because it was never promoted and probably quashed, and like a lot of them are.
And it was one of those where, basically doesn't have a happy ending. The bad guy basically gets away at the end.
Life is like that.
Well, sure. And it's nice when there's things that poke through every once in a while. I mean, because life isn't always like that. Life isn't always anyway. It's always shifting.
I rarely see movies that have the hero die for the many anymore, and they want a happy ending.
Sure.
But there used to be a lot of those, because that was literature they were basing it on.
Yeah.
But sacrifice was the message. And the good guy was the one that would give everything for the many, rather than the few. I don't see much of that anymore.
Which is funny. Again, it makes me... Sorry, my mind kind of pops around a little bit.
Oh, sure. Me too. I'm with you.
Robin Hood.
There you go.
The ultimate. But also, I can never look at Robin Hood the same, because where does the story begin? The story...
I'm not sure.
At least in... And it reminds me, just because of either the Kevin Costner version or even Robin Hood Men in Tights.
Very Disneyfied at that point.
Well, sure. But basically the idea was he was in prison in Jerusalem because he was fighting in the Crusades, which of course was the forced conversion that Christians were doing all over Europe and everywhere. he basically escapes from prison and makes his way back to England, and then the whole story begins. And then when the king comes back at the end, who's been missing the whole movie, or at least the Mel Brooks version kind of plays that part up a bit, comes back from, and they're like, oh, we just came back from fighting in the Crusades and all this stuff. And so, I mean, you know, the whole idea behind Robin Hood is good. But it's just that whole kind of part of the backstory, I can almost just not look at it the same. You know, because
interesting,
with the Crusade kind of angle in there. I mean, granted, it didn't really have much to do with the main ideas of, you know, kind of the
redistributing
wealth. Because that's a great part. But then it's also, it's like it shows just the nothing's perfect.
But it's where he gained his prowess, one, and also his lessons in life, the other, who to get even with.
Sure.
Which always makes sense. He's an anti-hero then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which are the best.
Oh, yeah.
It's rooted in wisdom, ultimately, experience.
Sure. Sure. And my favorite was the Dexter series. I don't know if you ever saw... there was the TV show, but the books were just...
I'm sure that those are over the top.
I mean, it was...
to what they had to cram into an hour of TV.
And just like the writer's style was just... It was all written in first person, all super psychological, and the whole short chapters it read like someone was having a conversation with you about their day.
Well, that's the best,
you know? And then basically the whole book he's just going around killing child molesters. So you don't really have too much of a problem, but it's just the style. There's dark humor. It's just, and
it's witty as well.
Oh, it's super witty, and just the author's style. Jeff Lindsay, he's awesome. Really, really good.
Fantastic. No, I'm learning a lot.
And it's interesting because I got into the show too. The first season and the first book were pretty close to each other. Few different things happened and they ended differently. But then after that, like the two stories go off in opposite directions. So you're watching like the show storyline and the book storyline, same characters, but different stuff's happening. It's kind of weird. But
that's fantastic though. That's brilliant.
It was interesting. But after reading a little bit more into the series, which is, I mean, it's amazing. I think in the third book, there's a few things that happen in the third book that, even if the show was on Showtime, I don't know how you would be able to accurately portray it. Like in just...
Yeah, editing's everything when it comes to presenting a show.
Sure. Well, it basically would come down to how do you show basically an 8-year-old kid killing somebody and feeling righteous for doing so. Like, feels the need, like he has that kind of like whatever that super, you know, the broken trauma that just makes someone's mind crack and just whatever.
It's how much you can empathize with the protagonist.
So it's just interesting. But yeah, book's amazing. Highly recommend it. He's also starting this other like detective series now, the same author, which he wrote one book of before the Dexter series, but Dexter series got more popular, obviously, so he went with that. But now that's
exposure now.
Right, now that that's over, he's getting back to the other one, and it's that super witty, dark, clever, it's intoxicating.
That must have come through in the series because it was so damn popular.
Oh yeah. Well, even then, I mean, I love Michael C. Hall. I used to watch 6 Feet Under. I'm a big fan of that because I was a big fan of American Beauty, which don't get me started on the whole Kevin Spacey thing. But just the style of American Beauty, Alan Ball, who is the creator, also did 6 Feet Under.
Lauren Ambrose. 6 Feet Under.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
She's in one of my favorite movies. Yeah. It's The Connection.
Sure. But yeah, no, I mean, it was good. So it's just kind of saying that same kind of just really dark but real, you know, kind of thing. And you get this just realistic...
yeah, it's poignant.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah. I mean, and in the end, you know, it's what I love to try to do with my books kind of get some of that message across and,
fantastic.
Poke through the fog, as they say. I mean, I obviously, if I don't like labels or being categorized too much, but if one were to about me, they would probably consider me a somewhat liberally minded person.
I try to stay away from those labels, especially.
But
I'm trying to find a new language.
Well, sure.
Like progressive instead of liberal. They haven't stigmatized that word yet.
Well, it's funny because
we already talked about that liberal and conservative have the same elements in each.
Well, yeah. Well, no, and that's it.
Absurd.
That's it, because and that's what brought me to think about that was,
it's false
I'm a
dichotomy.
pretty liberally minded person, but I've had some very admittedly very conservative people read my stuff and like what I have to say. Because they see how I'm trying to poke through some of the bullshit and bring it down to somewhat of a human level. Trying to come back to what makes us human. I mean, there's certain things we may never agree on, but there's so many things we can.
Well, again, like Judy Berry pointed out, the similarities, the commonalities.
Yes.
Because we have a lot more of that.
Oh yeah, big time.
They're never focused on, and that's what creates these.
So if we could,
false dichotomies.
Well, sure, because if we could start from there, we could start from that area,
keep bringing it back,
and we're used to interacting as human beings again, we might have a fighting chance at some of these, the harder things, And when I say that, I mean abortion, guns, all that stuff.
Controversial views on a lot of this.
Well, sure, but the point is, is that, we can, if we're used to talking to each other as humans. We'll be more likely to hear and be able to express, our opinions to each other without feel like we're being threatened. Like when people say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't, talk about politics and religion." That's one of the things that's always got me, right?
Yeah, Thanksgiving. Don't do that.
Right. To me, that's the problem. Because if people aren't used to talking about it much or at all, when they do, it's going to, of course they're going to have some uncritically thought out goofball,
usually
crazy,
They're just, it's the language and the buzzwords that we've been taught, the stigmatized language.
Yeah.
That's why I've been trying to find other words to use. And to some success, actually.
Sure.
If I stay away from the buzzwords, it doesn't set people off. And again, point out the commonalities and not the differences. My hair used to be as long as yours, if not longer.
Okay.
I'll have to show you sometime.
Sure.
But when I did cut it, I was treated differently by folks. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And if I put on a suit, even more so. Mm-hmm. But then to have progressive things come out of my mouth while looking conservative, they don't know what to do with that.
Well, I mean, you think you described about half of the Bay Area right there.
Once they lopped off their ponytails.
Well, yeah, it's the whole
the mid-90s.
It's like what happened to San Rafael, and yes, you can make the argument that yes, they're still liberally minded on that whatever label scale or whatever, but it's basically all the old hippies that got money and turned into these weird yuppie kind of Republican kind of characters. Again, the people who got money that basically went opposite of how they always thought because,
it's still crazy California to most of the rest of the country.
Oh, sure. But when you're the 6th largest economy in the world...
Exactly.
Bigger than most countries...
What happened to being the 4th? Did we slip to France?
Were we that high?
We were ahead of France back in the 90s.
Okay.
Well, that doesn't surprise me.
That would make sense during Clinton and the budget surplus and all that, kind of thing.
But that was the beginning of the end. I mean, just because he was a Democrat didn't mean.
Well, sure, and they still what was that? The
NAFTA,
Well,
Telecommunications Act.
No, it passed in the late '90s, where it basically allowed banks to also be investment banks. Like if there was whatever took that rule, it was a rule that went back to the '20s, probably that got put in after the stock market crash,
the Glass-Steagall.
Glass-Steagall, yeah, that's what I was trying to
was repealed by Clinton.
Right.
And it was God, I know their names. Drawing a blank because I'm rusty on it, but
Well, it's all good.
This is actually a part of my monopoly work explained within it. But it's an old law. And that's what created the Great Depression, actually, because there was the laws on the books in the teens and the 20s of the 20th century, back in the 19-teens and 1920s. It did allow for the investment firms and banks to merge, and they became gambling houses for our money.
Yeah.
And of course, you see what happened. And it's happening again.
Well, sure. I mean, the idea of the the smoky back room still certainly exists.
Well, yeah, it never went away. It never will go away.
Well, no, it just is as
as
evolved.
Vested interest.
It's evolved.
Certainly.
It might not be literally guys in a back room with cigars and snifters of brandy or cognac or whatever the fuck they would drink in some giant. Yeah. And even then, it probably still is in some ways.
Just the most rare cognac and expensive.
Oh yeah, I mean, especially if you're talking about like Bohemian Grove or kind of things like that.
Which is actually a liaison between the working class and the ruling class, the owning class, Bohemian Grove, which is why it has any profile at all. They have other clubs you never hear about.
Well, of course. But one thing I always thought about was interesting with them especially was my mom used to know somebody who, used to be,
He attended there?
Well, he was a world-renowned like furniture refinisher.
I would get an invite.
And so basically it just gave a kind of an inside story of what actually, happened because, you watch Who's the Nutbag info?
Jones.
Yeah. I mean, you know what I was going to say.
He used to be a regular guy.
Right.
Something happened to him.
Yeah. So after hearing the story from someone who was like actually there, it was interesting where he said once you went in, there was like the big main club, but then there was other kind of separate little clubs.
Absolutely.
Again,
so like it's how they interact with the working class.
So the Bushes were in one, the Kissingers and the old folks were in one, but then also there was another one for like artists and people who were into alternative energy, and Mickey Hart,
the drummer.
Yeah. Bohemian Grove in with all them people, by the way.
Well, sure, it's because he's high profile.
But that was always the interesting thing to me, because here you got some of the biggest power brokers in the entire world in the same private club with people that they're exact opposite with in real life.
It's in their interest.
And it's like that weird balance thing, yeah. But it's like it was like a physical representation of people who probably you could make the argument actually control stuff, actually trying to push that balance.
Well, absolutely.
It's just interesting.
They never stop. They can.
Well, sure.
Yeah. I mean, wealth is its own monster, really. It's like riding the tiger.
Yeah.
There's no other reason to stay on it than that if you get off, you'll be eaten.
Yeah.
It is its own end to a means. And you're born into it, you're screwed. I mean, there's a lot of ruling class people that have tried to bail, and they've paid the price as well. I feature them in a martyr's column all their own in my Topography of Power.
Okay, cool.
Because they've made many sacrifices themselves, just wanting to restore some balance. Carroll Quigley is one of the main ones. He was a teacher at Clinton, at Princeton,
a
history teacher. And he published some books that are now banned. But you can get them online, of course, because they've been republished. A group of lawyers in LA just put out Hope and Tragedy Against, 1,200-page tome that is the real history of Western capitalism, not the one that's taught to us.
Okay.
And it explains just a little too much for the owning class's interest.
Well, and it made me think again about John Perkins over there. Because that was part of when he was building the history of why they were. Because he was basically just an economist. He wasn't, worked for a contractor who worked for the CIA or the NSA or whoever the hell it was.
That was his PhD.
But it basically all went back to Milton Friedman.
Of course.
Chicago School of Economics
exactly.
or whatever, which basically sprung out of everybody who was pissed off at Roosevelt after the New Deal.
Exactly.
And it all just stemmed back all the way back to that.
Moral reason for greed.
Yeah.
And he perfected it.
Yeah.
And now their poster child is, what's her name? Ayn Rand?
Who, when she died, was collecting Social Security.
Of course.
So he's just, it's funny, but it makes sense in some way because it just feeds into the whole hypocrisy.
And her hero and role model was a sociopath.
Well, she was a sociopath. If you only look out for yourself, and that's all you care about, isn't that like the definition of a sociopath?
Yes, no empathy.
Right.
Exactly.
And that's what she always preached against. Even all those like little films of her talking and all the little video clips and stuff that I've seen or whatever come across. Yeah.
It's astonishing how when I was in HSU, there were students that swore by her, wrote papers about her. They didn't include what we just mentioned, of course.
Well, no. Because it would destroy the whole argument, but
not muddy the water.
Sure. Yeah.
Can't have that.
No.
But yeah, Milton Friedman, you bet. I won't get into it here.
It's just interesting how a lot of it'll, go back to that. And you can trace it. And,
what are your books about?
Just really they deal with a lot of issues going on. Again, using kind of a fictional story to talk about things: adventure, love story, humor, suspense.
Yeah, characters.
Conspiracies. My character is Jason and Christina. Basically, Jason started out as an investigative reporter, broke a big story.
Whoa, cool.
Got the big job in New York. Christina was a forensic biologist, basically. So they were both kind of truth seekers. Her from the scientific side, him from the kind of more human people journalistic side.
Psychological, analytical
side.
Right,
yeah.
A muckraker.
Yeah.
Truth seeker.
Exactly.
A lot of my heroes are investigative journalists.
Yeah.
They're very few and far between now. But
Seymour Hersh, you got to have him on that list.
Yes, sir.
Greg Palast.
I was going to say, Palast is one of the...
Yeah! Well, every once in a while, I'll see him get interviewed. It's funny. He works for the BBC but he's in America. There's just no American news outlet will even employ him because of a lot of the stories he's done.
Do you ever get to hear Tom Hartman on KGOE?
Sometimes,
1480?
Yeah. Sometimes.
Palast is a regular.
Not all the time, but is he?
I've learned a lot from Hartman.
Yeah, no, he has some good
particularly about our founding fathers, which I quote heavily. So.
Sure.
Like, there were 3 different definitions for tyranny in the Federalist Papers.
Okay.
But the most important one was what they called an unnatural accumulation of wealth, which was the only articulation they had for it. But again, that was like kings having sovereignty over everything. They had too much wealth. So the idea for the founding fathers was to keep wealth distributed evenly amongst them and not have anyone get too wealthy.
Because power corrupts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But for this reason, corporations were illegal and stayed illegal for decades in this country. And not very many people know that. Mm-hmm. When they were finally allowed, they were only allowed to be around for 10 years at a time and had to serve a public good. But then they were disbanded after that. And then in the late 1800s, Rockefeller, who was beginning to amass unnatural amounts of wealth.
With all oil and railroads and all that shit, yeah.
Yeah, Ohio wouldn't let him keep his corporation, and that's why he jumped ship to New Jersey, because Jersey said, screw it. We're going to ignore that law. You can do that here. And that set a precedent, and ever since then, it's just been no looking back.
Yeah.
And corporations have just been gaining momentum and power like crazy. A metaphor for a corporation would be the Roman fasci, which is a bundle of sticks with an axe head in it. And I just saw this mentioned again. I just watched a documentary on Spartacus.
Okay.
You're probably familiar with Spartacus.
Mm-hmm.
They actually mention the fasci in this documentary, which I've never seen. They usually ignore it.
Okay.
It's actually hanging on the walls of Congress, for God's sakes. And it was Prescott Bush that put them there in 1947.
Oh, yeah. That guy was a character.
But check it out. I'll show you a photograph. That's what's in my Topography of Power, a very large photograph of that.
Okay.
But the Roman fascie is a bundle of sticks. It's actually on the back of the Roosevelt dime for a while, too. I have one of them. I'll show you.
Yeah.
But it was ancient Rome's way of combining all the senators and wealth owners from the entire region and combining them into one strong stick. The little sticks became this one big log. And you put the axe head in it, and it was invincible. It could cut through anything. And it's a symbol that they still use in this country, being a republic, modeled after Rome. Sure. They borrowed heavily from it. But in the documentary, they called it a fascie, not a fascie. Mussolini coined the term from this fascie. That's where fascism comes from.
Yeah, this
is the Roman fascie.
That would make sense.
Which, by the way, he was asked when he gave a talk in Detroit in 1928, because he was a guest in the breadbasket of the country. So was Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
They were often revered and talked a lot about before World War II. Fascism was something that they were trying to make popular here in this country. But he was asked by a reporter, and George Seldes wrote this in a book called Facts and Fascism, which was published in 1948.
Mm-hmm.
But it's now a banned book as well, and it's really hard to find, but it's out there. But they asked Mussolini, what is fascism? And he says, it's two things, not just one thing. It's a spirit, fascismo. It's something that a person lives. So this is what was trying to make it popular and something that everybody could get around. But it's also reaction.
Well, sure.
Fascismo is reaction. Yeah, you can see that.
Yeah.
It was a reaction to socialist gains made by the labor parties at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
So that was the most profound definition I've ever heard. Because not only is it trying to win the hearts of people, but also it blatantly says, we can't have this. We can't have labor taking back the wealth that we've accrued, which is really what it was always the struggle of the haves and have-nots.
Well, sure.
But our quality of life is because of the labor movement. There was no 8-hour workday. There was no child labor laws.
Well, yeah, and it's
safe practices in the factories.
I mean, in that, just all the battles, and I always, again, it always just goes back to the history, but the old Union battles of the turn of the century and in the 20s and 30s when they were trying to get these things and they were being beaten and killed all over the place.
Big Bill Haywood was hung.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I'm sure he was one of many that probably were.
He was just one of the most prolific.
The people that fought for that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Not just being taught anymore.
Well, no, and it's funny because I think the reason why they're not around anymore is also part of the reason why an increasingly number of working class people, or maybe not increasingly number, but a portion of the population has always been there. That's very working class, nobody you'd consider rich, or probably even middle class, that are very conservative. I think the answer of why those things kind of go hand in hand.
It's generational. We had such a healthy middle class that this stuff just went out the window. It was taken for granted. I mean, when I was really little, I couldn't believe how great we had it. And I even remember asking my dad, has it always been this way? As I looked at other countries and it was just, whoa, how do we have it so great? And why isn't the whole world like this? And I had no idea about the Great Depression then yet, or anything that came before us, or why wars happened. And he didn't really have an answer for me. He said, of course, Michael. Of course it's always been this way and always will be this way. Bullshit.
Yeah.
Not even. No, only since World War II had it been that way, and he's only as old as that. 1932 is when he was born. He came of age during World War II, and there was a huge corporate effort then too to make us all feel like we were in the same boat about that time, which was the Reagan administration propagandist effort too, that we're all in the same boat, the trickle-down theory. If we rise, you'll rise with us, kind of thing. Not at all. But that's what happened.
Which could have been true if both people were being fed at the same time, but they weren't.
Because one's a commodity and the other is an owning interest.
Of course.
But they never point that out. They can't.
No, because it would disprove the whole theory. You know.
Yeah, that's why it happens, because we are a commodity ultimately, a faceless, nameless commodity to the owning class. Labor commodity, the prime commodity. There are no commodities without labor, and we have to be maintained, controlled, managed. And since the media, which right in that name as well, it's something in the middle. Media means in the middle. It's in between direct experience and the perceiver.
Sure.
And that's a fascist wet dream right there.
So what do we do to try to kind of flip that?
Take language back from what's stigmatized would be the first step. Create a language that is common. And like I was also saying, that we're all really do have more in common than differences. There's 4 things that keep us all fighting, and you'll notice that Congress bring them up all the time. And we think that these Congress people are stupid, that they're just behind the times or backward in their thinking.
Well, it's all strategic.
They bring it up because it causes a huge fuss.
Well, of course, it's distraction.
Absolutely, but it does keep us fighting, and that's why it's always on the table. Those 4 things are religion and race, sexuality, and gender. Mm-hmm. And that's why they keep putting them out there, and they keep us fighting and keep us from being unified.
Because they know if we were,
it'd be like the labor unions all over again.
They wouldn't. There'd be nothing they could do.
And they couldn't back then either. That's because we had so much manufacturing in the country.
And we had the numbers. We had the I don't know. It's why I've always been a
73% were unionized.
A firm believer in critical mass.
Well, sure, a threshold.
Yeah,
because
if 73% of the workforce was unionized, okay, so you get 73% of the fucking
7 out of 10.
If you got 7 out of 10 people in the entire country to support something, you would be
landslide.
Yeah, wouldn't even be a question.
I mean, it scared the hell out of them, and that's where Milton Friedman comes in, of course, about that time.
Well, sure, and there will always be some sort of that backlash or backwards thinking or however you want to describe it, because it is
vested interest,
right? Because in the end, it is part of that balance, right?
Sure.
No matter how much we want to squash that or get rid of that type of thinking or those kind of attitudes, I'm not going to say that we need it, but or how I like to describe it is we will never be able to fully erase it, no matter what we do. However, personal opinion, throw it out there, we may not be able to ever delete it. However, we'll be able to shrink it a lot more in its size and its influence to the point where it's kind of shoved in a corner. And it's relegated basically to what I like to call the crazy street preacher on the corner. People know he's out there and he's saying all this crazy stuff. Nobody really pays attention.
Well, that's how, we used to treat fanatical religions.
Yeah.
When we had a healthy middle class.
Yeah.
It's there, we can tolerate it, but no one really pays much attention.
And so that's, I guess in my mind, that's, in some way as good as we can hope. To at least gain the upper hand in conscious humanity or whatever.
Absolutely. This is the premise of the whole healthy middle class that we did enjoy. There were enough regulations in place to ensure quality of life for everyone.
Yeah.
And quality of life comes from law.
Yeah.
Something else that they don't teach, which amazed a lot of my fellow students. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's law that determines our quality of life. And that's why it's been dwindling, because they're refunneling the whole GDP into their pockets, which would steadily raise right up to the mid-80s, and then it leveled out. And it's not that we're not working harder, we're actually working more, but that wealth is now going into the pockets of a few.
Yeah.
It's a privatization model, economic model, as opposed to the socialist model that we didn't have since the 30s.
Yeah.
And not socialism like state socialism. Those are two different things.
Well, of course, but I mean, even now we still have, socialistic aspects of...
Absolutely. A social democracy has to have by and for the people.
Well, yeah, I mean,
socialism is peopleism.
If you want roads, if you want a fire department, if you want a police
Public
department,
schools.
It's
buying for the people. It's peopleism.
Well, I mean, and then that was always the funny thing. The best part, the most like direct example of the hypocrisy of people that are basically against that was during the whole Obamacare kind of fight.
Which
where
isn't,
people were
single payer healthcare at all.
Well, of course.
It's actually Romney's model from was it New Jersey?
Yeah.
Massachusetts.
But when people are standing there with signs that say keep your government hands off my Medicare, it just describes it so good on how no wonder people no wonder they think what they think, because they don't even know what they think.
Exactly. Yeah, it's an oxymoron.
Yeah. It's like have you ever, found yourself, somebody does some crazy thing and you're like, man, what was that person thinking? Right? Well, maybe the problem is they weren't thinking. And when you put energy into asking what somebody was thinking when they obviously weren't, you're going to drive yourself nuts trying to make sense of what was in, I guess a senseless action almost. I don't know.
A reactionary.
Yeah, I mean, I've found myself kind of in that myself before.
Well, we're all human.
Yeah. Definitely are. Yes. And what else could we be? I mean, besides
robots.
Yeah, aliens.
Programmed robots.
Well, with AI and all that stuff, but I think we're a long ways from that.
Nice to think.
Well, have you ever...
There goes labor right there.
Well, sure. But Michio Kaku, you ever seen him, the Japanese guy?
Yeah, I used to listen to him quite a bit.
Yeah.
Fortunately, he was relegated to Coast to Coast, which is another nutbag show that features a whole lot of crazy people that muddies the water.
Yeah.
They like to mix truth with sensationalism quite a bit, so I don't really listen anymore, but he's been a featured guest, but usually about the mysteries of the universe.
Sure.
Physics.
But
what are wormholes, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. No doubt. All these people that are afraid that AI is going to take over next week, he's like, these people are nuts. He's like, we haven't even been able to map the human brain yet.
Well, yeah, no one understands what consciousness is.
Right, and
There's
until
no physical tool that can. There's only one tool that can, and that's consciousness itself.
Of course.
Which is a built-in failsafe.
Of course, and so until that happens, it's not going to really... It has
happened, it's just once you're at that level, you have no stake in manipulating matter anymore.
Yeah.
You see that it's all one. And it doesn't really matter.
No. Yeah, which is
quote
interesting.
Punk song.
Oh yeah.
From Romeo Void, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
1980.
Okay. Well, I love some of that old stuff. Some of the
I grew up
kind
on
of
it. Can't help it.
Even into Propagandhi in the 90s. I had a lot of friends that listened to NoFX and stuff. Propagandhi was an interesting group.
It's a great name.
Yeah. No, they had a couple songs that were really good, but music will always be, it's just another medium. It's another medium, whether it's music, whether it's writing, whether it's painting, whether it's clay, whether it's
music's the ultimate.
I mean, whatever
Actually,
it is.
film is the ultimate because it takes all of those and put them in one place.
Yeah.
But music is emotion.
But also, the other ones can serve because even though it may encompass everything, you could take each of those singular aspects that make up it, the writing and everything else. If you have just one of those things can have strength in and of themselves because they don't have everything else behind them.
Well, I only went back to visual art because of my visual cartography.
Sure.
It actually does have something to say. Otherwise, I've given up. is entirely relative, and anyone can.
Well, it's about finding your vehicle too. What reaches you? What you know? There's enough things going on. We need this like kind of multi-pronged attack from whatever people's strengths are and passions are, and it's going to come from a million different directions, and it's going to help once we
get together.
Yeah, and put good energy towards these things that draw us in, and realize that everybody's going to get drawn in by something different. You know?
Once I started trying to paint the visual cartography, it occurred to me that this has actually already been done. Diego Rivera was painting that way.
Sure.
And this happens to be a part of the Cradleable Rock, with him painting that mural in the RCA Tower, Rockefeller's Tower, and him going over the top with the contract, and then being very unhappy with him making statements about the owning class, since they were among them.
Well, sure.
That wasn't in the contract, Rockefeller kept saying. Diego refused to take it out, and they ultimately destroyed the mural, and that's when art took a turn.
Yeah.
The owning class decided art can no longer teach. We can't have this. Let's just have it about abstracts. And postmodern art was born. I already told you all about that.
Yeah.
So it's pointless.
But no, but it it makes sense. It
alienated people from art at that point.
Well, sure.
And now they call them artists and non-artists in school. And artists think of themselves as artists, and you're a non-artist if you don't understand.
Which is yes, but what we can't lose sight of amidst all of that, what we can't lose sight of is that initial thing that drew us in the first place. Because no matter how much they try to chop it up or divide it or whatever they try to change it, however that gets done, we can't let them win, for lack of a better phrase.
Well, my visual cartography isn't going away too soon.
I mean, even if we're not selling it.
I had no intention of selling it. That would have compromised my power. Right there, if I'm not selling it, they can't sue me. They can't tell me what to do with it.
Yeah.
If it's not a commodity, then no one has any kind of a lawsuit against me because it's not for profit.
Right.
No, I mean, there's many reasons I wasn't going to sell it. So I had the day job. That was important. But since I lost that, I could no longer support the art any longer. I only got halfway through the production. Like I was saying, there were 5 unique subject topics that I wanted to tackle, and they all are a source of confusion in the West. And consciousness is one of them. That's why it's the second work.
Sure.
There's really a lot to say about consciousness. Alan Watts and Richard Albert, there you go.
Oh, I love
That's
that.
why I love those guys.
Yeah. But I love Thoreau, too.
Sure, absolutely. Emerson. Yeah.
And
they're coming from the same
Well,
place.
and it's interesting, and maybe it's just because I have a fascination with John Brown, and knowing that Thoreau was like the only backer of his, like up until the end, made me have a little more respect for Thoreau than Emerson in that way.
No, it makes perfect sense.
But the whole Walden Pond thing, like you were talking about metaphors earlier, that's almost what I think of with the marsh. Okay, people talked a lot of crap. And I'll explain.
No, I can see it already.
Because the stuff that people talk crap about Thoreau for doing Walden Pond, when he's writing this like big kind of tome about nature.
It was a metaphor.
And he's a mile outside of New Jersey, like right in the middle of it. And they're like, but that was the point. Was finding that within all that craziness going on.
Which is what has to happen.
Yeah.
There's a thread of golden truth through all of dogmatic religions, for example.
Well, sure.
It's the dogma that ruined it. We could even argue the cultural clothing it's garbed in.
Well, in the control, in the historical time period when a lot of these,
for the control.
Yeah.
The differences.
It's a lot more primitive
instead of the likenesses.
Yeah.
And it's all man-made rather than experiential.
Well, of course.
Which again, the East stays away from. Most of the Eastern religions say if you can't get a hands-on experience from this, then it's dogmatic, it's useless. You're just following someone's opinion. But what most of the Eastern practices will give you is the experience.
Sure.
And aim for it. Like Zen is the most no bullshit. Because that's, Japanese. They don't like a lot of clothing or garb on it. It's very sterile. It's right to the point, no bullshit. Mm-hmm. But you get Zen koans then. Ways of phrasing things that push the rational mind to its limit. And if you're right for awakening, that right to the edge of your rational mind, you might just flip over into the intuitive. And it works if you're there, if you're ready for it.
Yeah.
But I find those things fascinating because it really does bend your mind.
Well, and that's one of the things we always have to be open to is being able to have our mind bent. We can't ever get to a point where we think, oh, well, I'm perfect now. I got nothing more I got to think, or nothing more I got to experience, no matter how knowledgeable we become. Because that's when we shut ourselves off and we start...
growth stops.
Yeah. I mean, it was funny. Again, it was a... Slow down. Put your thoughts in order. Okay. What was the movie? Swing Vote. Kevin Costner. Interesting. Basically about, this...
Another movie I've heard of.
Basically, he was this, swing voter, and... the whole election came down to, one county, and then it ended up in this county, it was one vote, and it was him. I mean, it was done for comedic effect and, make a point. Reason I bring it up is his 10-year-old daughter was giving this speech in her, this little presentation in her 5th grade class or whatever in the movie. And she basically said, at first we were slaves. Then we became free. And then we became complacent. Then we became apathetic, which led back to slavery. And it just always made so much sense to me. And it was, again, maybe it's the, out of the mouths of babes. The fact that kind of thing was coming out of a 10-year-old little girl, it gave it so much more power to me. And because it's true. It's like, okay, so if we're free, if we're fighting for this thing and trying to make society better and trying to improve things, we have to realize that there's no there. It's a constant journey. Because the moment we think that we have it, it proves that we don't. And it's
the limits of the rational mind.
Sure, and it's scary because then you're like, oh, well, what's the point? Because it's never going to be fully done, but and maybe that's life is always the whole life's a journey, not a destination thing.
Absolutely.
Kind of.
I'm a lot more cynical about the slavery and complacency thing. There's always been a fence there. It's just how big the fence is. Now that it's shrinking, you can't ignore it. But when we had a healthy middle class, it was still there.
Well, sure.
But way the hell out there. So
yeah.
It seems like freedom. But ultimately, they're still moving the chess pieces and have been for a long time. And only a few families.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, what was it? The Wizard of Oz, which is Yip Harburg that did all the songs, blacklisted in the 50s. Anyways, the reason I brought it up,
metaphors.
Yeah,
again.
The biggest, best one out of the whole, because I mean the whole movie was filled with this stuff, especially with the Oompa Loompas and the working class and the whole thing. But when they finally find the wizard, right, and he's like, "Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain," and then sounding like this all-powerful, all-knowing thing that controls everything. And it's like this wrinkled old man that doesn't really have any power, can't really do anything.
Except to control everyone else.
Right.
Their perceptions of
Well, it shows the illusion, or the illusion that it really is. And it plays, it plays into it.
Absolutely. I'd have to agree. That is the challenge.
I mean, that is obviously the ultimate challenge that is constantly evolving and changing. So what the opponent looked like before isn't what it looks like now, and as humanity evolves or mutates, if you will, it's That's the.
Again, I'm just so cynical. Anyone that does get really successful at unbrainwashing people tend to have accidents or diseases that are incurable.
Well, sure, but that doesn't mean it can't. It's going to stop it. There's always going to be someone else. You know,
it just means I'm not ready to be a martyr. But I sure do love sharing what I've learned along the way, and I hope that the visual cartography and your books will turn lights on for people.
That's the goal. That's the goal.
Because if I can just answer a few questions or demystify some of the confusion,
yeah,
I've done something more than nothing.
And that's doing something.
I've been trying to figure out how to create a movement without having any head to it that's identifiable. That would confound the shit out of me.
Well, and that's what what some people were saying about like the Occupy movement. Was because it didn't really have a head. But what was interesting, one of the main points that Scott Ritter brought, bringing it back to that art of the waging peace, when the art of war towards the peace, whatever. That was his part of his argument, was that it needs a hierarchy, it needs a structure. He said that it wasn't, that they weren't winning because it was free form like that.
No, it's because no one could leave their job and no one could leave their school.
Because that's part of the whole game, where they get you stuck in the kind of survival
lockdown,
the survival cycle.
Especially now with costs.
Yeah.
No livable wage.
Well,
no one can even sneeze without feeling it.
Yeah.
Without hurting.
Yeah.
Again, the fence is really tight, but no one sees it as a fence. Unless it's those damn lazy liberals making it hard for everyone.
Well, it's the perception.
Absolutely. Control the perception, you control the reality. That's even spiritual, ultimately.
That's so funny. Sometimes the metaphors that I think of and where my mind goes sometimes. The Simpsons. I was remembering this old Simpsons episode, Halloween, one of the Halloween specials.
Watch a lot of that on YouTube.
And there was one of the best ones, and it wasn't, scary at all. I mean, none of them were like scary, whatever. But, anyways, it was one that was like the Twilight Zone, and all the advertisements came alive and started fucking breaking the city and starting things on fire and basically taking over the city.
Yeah.
And so how they ended up stopping him at the end, they're like, how do you stop an advertisement? Is you stop looking at it. And so it was funny, they're all attacking the city and the whole town like turns their back to them, and they're still doing it for a little while, and then they crumble. And again, it's a good metaphor for that too.
It's truly brilliant.
Because once we stop putting our faith in it, it will go away. But the fact of it's so concreted in with this survival cycle and this, it's
reinforced by fear.
Right, which kind of goes back into the whole Martin Luther King line of, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are little acts that we can do along the way to help bend it.
And that's what it takes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, any little bend or any little kink or any, it's, we've done something. Because you take those kind of the greatest people in history that, also didn't have, weren't perfect human beings either, Martin Luther King or Gandhi or, Malcolm X, when he came back from Mecca and realized that, there was Muslims of all colors and all this stuff. If people like that, all they could do was take it the next step, you're talking the greatest, that's all we can do. But the more people that do that from all different angles and all different ways and all different mediums, the better off we'll be, and the more bends that will be bending the arc of the moral universe, so to speak.
Aren't a lot of us that are fearless enough to be completely honest? That's important, though.
And that's part of it too. Looking in the mirror,
being genuine.
I mean, wasn't that a Gandhi line, right? Be the example you want to see in the world.
Absolutely, be the change.
Or be the change, yeah.
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 Yeah, you have to live your truth. Walk the walk, as you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
And there's no talking it at all.
There's no point. There's no point. But and you know, that's where you don't want to get stuck too far down the rabbit hole and realize there are a lot more good people in the world than there are bad. It's just the way, it's because of all those illusory kind of effects of survival and this job and the economy and the everything else that kind of pulls us away from nature, I guess.
And then bad's a fine line too.
Well,
desperate,
sure.
There's a lot of desperate people.
Well, sure.
That only know certain behaviors.
Well, sure.
That aren't necessarily constructive.
And I guess the idea is, you know, is the whole black and white thing and how it doesn't exist. You know, the generalizations. Well, I think at least once we start realizing that it is all gray, and each one of these things that happen, these desperate people, they're not all desperate for the same reasons, or with the same backgrounds, or the same upbringings, or the same experience, or whatever it may be.
They are a result of our conditioning.
Once at least we start from that position, not saying that that's going to solve everything right away, but it seems to be, it would at least put us in a better position. It would give us a better foundation to work from.
Understanding is everything.
Yeah, because at least if you could come from that perspective, then maybe you have a fighting chance. You know?
It will allow for change.
Yeah. I mean, and
that's scary for some folks.
Well, sure.
It would mean responsibility.
I mean, you're either gonna roll with the punches or you're gonna fight against it. But change is gonna come. Wasn't that oh God, can't think of a 70s soul song. You should know. Anyway, but yeah. It's
my mind is too full of other examples like The Winds of Change,
Oh yeah.
and Starship.
Oh yeah. Or how about one of my favorite lines from Stairway to Heaven, which the song is obviously very poetic with the words and everything of I forget the line right before that kind of leads into it, but it's basically your stairway lies on a whispering wind. Mm-hmm. So if you go with the metaphor of buying a stairway to heaven, you're trying to buy your way into goodness, right? And so if someone's looking for that stairway and trying to buy it in their journey, realizing that stairway is lying, you know, in the wind because you're going whichever way the wind blows, but it's whispering, you know, and you kind of got, you know, so it just, I don't know, it just played under the whole like metaphor of the whole thing.
It's not a howling wind. It's subtle.
Well, no, it's very subtle, but it's there. And it's constant.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But it just, I don't know, the line always got me.
Well, now it's got me. That's, yeah.
Or Jethro Tull skating away on the thin ice of it. We're all skating away on the thin ice of a new day.
Hell
One of my favorite songs.
Yeah.
I mean, just that line right there. I mean, the whole song's great.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, one of the things
that,
yeah. So it's, again, like you said, music has, music has a way of that.
It planted the seed in me for questioning.
Sure.
More than anything else.
Yeah.
It was music before reading. Reading was a result of music.
Mm-hmm.
Lyrics were very important to me.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's why I love rock and roll so much, at least the kind that I grew up on.
Well, sure. I mean, I love a lot of the stuff from the 60s and 70s. I really love blues when it comes down to a lot of that.
Most of it is blues based, yeah.
But like old blues, Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, 20s, 30s. And part of it is because it's like, it's basic, not basically, it was, whatever, the music of an oppressed people. Because
Absolutely.
what they had to do to travel around just to, I couldn't even Imagine, and you listen to some of these songs, and they're talking about like real issues and things going on, like in society, you know, way like so much sooner than like popular white music did. Now there was some folk singers, you know, Pete Seeger was around in the '40s, and some old Woody Guthrie songs
it's
like that. But it was,
rhythms.
But yeah, it was different.
And blues is uniquely American.
Yeah.
West African slave marriage. Just when it was hopeless, you played the blues, sang the blues.
And then putting that out there was the first step in getting over it.
Absolutely.
Because that's why they always say singing the blues makes them feel better. Because if you just took it on its face, you're like, oh, this person's depressed, and they're talking about how they're depressed and how there's, but that's not the point. The point is putting it out there, because it's like, okay, so if there's something you're going to get over, in the process of letting go, you have to display it, because you have to know what you're trying to get over.
Emote it.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah. So...
And music got awful powerful.
Well, that was right in that same time period.
Absolutely.
You know, one of my favorite songs still from back then, I always loved Leadbelly in particular. I mean, those other guys too, and I love, you know, I don't know, there's
I guess
a bunch
some more on the ladder of things like Screamin' Jay and Howlin' Wolf.
Well, sure. I mean, I love Buddy Guy. Buddy Guy's great. I mean, there was a few people into that kind of era, but I don't know. What made me think of it was, I mean, if you ever heard the song Bourgeois Blues, Leadbelly, yeah, singing in the 20s about how Washington D.C. was messed up for the black man, and that was
archetypal.
That was like 100 years ago. And it's like not much has changed in 100. I mean, it's evolved, but I mean, you got some of the worst ghettos in the country, unfortunately, within sight of all the government buildings, and that in and of itself is a metaphor.
Most large cities, it's just like that. The slums are right next to the financial district.
It's just in DC's case, it's, you know, it's, and probably because it's DC, it's you know, the meaning is exponential.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah. But so it's crazy. I don't know. I just loved his story. I looked into it a little bit. The guy toured around for 30 years before he even recorded a song. By the time he made it popular in the 30s and 40s, he was an old man already. And he made it onto like NBC radio and stuff. Like, he made it big by the end of his career. But for 30 years, he was performing before he even recorded anything. Like, I couldn't...
Most things were belonging to the commons then.
Yeah.
It just belonged to everyone. Nothing was ever patented or sold.
But man,
it's a way of life.
I just think of like people now and like the dedication that it would take to do that. I mean, do you think the average musician would be okay with touring for 30 years having never recorded a song?
I have to wonder. I wonder what a few of people I've met along the way who were doing just that, whatever became of them. They're not recording.
No.
You can't find them anywhere.
Yeah.
Did they die? Are they still doing it?
I don't know.
I'd love to know, especially this one gentleman.
Yeah.
I'll play his tape sometime. You just wouldn't believe it. Wouldn't believe it, this guy. He should have recorded it. What happened to him? And he wasn't interested in wealth. He just wanted to live it.
Yeah.
And share it. Keep moving and changing.
That's what we have to do.
There's growth in that. I guess that's there's magic in that.
Well, it definitely is. Definitely magic.
It's ecstatic then rather than static.
Yeah. Well, it's the constant movement. The big wheel in the sky keeps on turning, and I don't know where I'll be tomorrow. But
I loved that song.
Oh, Journey was great.
At least Infinity was great.
Yeah.
You ever hear the early stuff before Steve Perry joined?
No.
It's progressive. No. It's jazz fusion. It'd blow you away.
Sure.
Because they came out of Santana.
Okay.
The whole group was Santana's backup band that left in '73. In fact, Greg Rowley sang Black Magic Woman originally.
Oh, interesting.
And still did backup on Infinity. and he was the keyboardist.
Okay.
They're Bay Area.
Okay. Yeah, I was saying, yeah. Because Santana was right from there.
Yeah.
No, for sure.
He's, Tijuana originally, but wound up in the Haight-Ashbury.
Yeah. Yeah, with the whole scene that was happening.
Became a music scene.
Yeah.
Just like Seattle did in the 90s, for whatever reason, but everyone was drawn to that region.
Well, yeah, Jimi Hendrix was from there.
Yeah, originally, yeah.
You know?
Amazingly enough.
But...
had to go to Britain to be heard.
And that was always the interesting thing, at least about Nirvana, was like, I might have not really been like a huge Nirvana fan like some people, or even now. But I always thought that like you had to, or at least me, I've always had respect. Because they changed everything. Whether you like the style of music or not, like, it changed like, what was considered popular rock and roll that was played on the radio after that was different.
Dude, I heard them before they were popular on college radio in San Francisco in 1991, and I loved them. It's like, who's this? Nirvana? Yeah. This is fantastic. But they hadn't even been signed to a contract yet. It was a demo.
Yeah. I mean, and he had good...
KSFU.
But yeah. I mean, there was a couple of, stragglers, but there was no hair band music after that. It's not what was played on the radio. I mean, yeah, groups like Warrant and stuff and Guns N' Roses were halfway popular into like 92 and 93, but not really.
They were great when they came out in 87.
Well, yeah.
That first album, that's all that carried them through after that. They were a one album band.
Well, it's because Axl Rose was like the ultimate asshole of all assholes. Slash is still on the list I could consider of top guitarists or whatnot.
Well, the riffs on that album are impossibly fucking-tastic.
Yeah.
And they're his.
It's him.
Yeah.
I mean, Axl Rose was like, it's just, I don't know. The guy always got me. When they got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years, 5 years ago.
Track of all that stuff.
But anyways, the reason I bring it up is because whenever people get inducted, right, they always perform. And so sometimes it's really cool because it'll bring bands together that haven't played in 20 or 25 years. And obviously there was like the ultimate rift between Slash and Axl and probably the other band members and all this stuff. He's fun. He's a dickhead. Whatever. Anyway. So Slash and all them were like willing to put it aside. And we're like, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, let's do this.
Too bad.
He didn't even show up.
That's too bad.
I mean,
he hardly ever shows up.
Well, that was always his thing. And if he did show up, he was like 3 hours late.
Classic narcissist.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Well, it's true. It's true. Well, thank you for joining me for the newest episode of my Search for Truth podcast. I really, just really enjoy having the opportunity to do this.